Yeah, what's up, everybody? It's Infinity Craft Studio here. On regards of the most people requesting, have been requesting that we should create the tutorial on how we edit our photos. The method that we decided to use and stick with is frequent separation. And without wasting your time, guys, I'm going to jump in straight and show you how we prepare all the layers and how we're going to use the mixer brush tool. The very first step you're going to do is duplicate the background layer twice. So the middle layer, you're going to name it low frequency layer. And the upper one, you're going to name it high frequency layer. And then hide the higher frequency layer. Select the low frequency layer. Go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. So the lights should be accordingly to the texture of your picture. So the higher the texture, the higher the radius. Until you see the texture of the skin disappearing. And then press OK. For me, it was 8. Then select the high frequency layer and bring it back. Go to Image, Apply Image. On the Layer panel, select the low frequency layer. And then Invert should be unchecked. On the blending mode, select Subtract. And then scale should be 2, offset should be 128. All this will be unchecked, all those boxes. Press OK. Then blending mode should be linear light to bring all your detail back. So you're done preparing all the two layers. Then the next step going to be duplicating all these layers. Duplicate the higher frequency layer and create a clipping mask between the high frequency layer and the high frequency copy. Bring back the high frequency layer copy blending mode into normal. Then scroll down to the low frequency layer, duplicate it, and create a clipping mask between the low frequency layer copy and the low frequency layer. And then we're going to select a type of brush that we're going to use to brush. It's always a mixer brush tool for me. I mean, all this process need a mixer brush tool. Hardness should be 0. So the loaded brush mode, I mean, should be clean brush. Clean brush, select. That one should be unchecked. And that one should be checked. The second one, brush tool should be selected. Wetness should be 30. Load should be 30. Mix should be 30. Flow should be 30. And that one is 10. As you can see, the angle, it doesn't really matter. But it should be 0. So the box on the sample layer should be unchecked. And now we are going to see, I mean, the foreground color should be white. The foreground color should be white. And now you're ready to brush. While selecting the low frequency layer is the one that we're going to do all our job. And going to start painting. So the painting mode should be like in a circular way, or while you're mixing your skin. So the thing to consider here is mostly is balancing. So that means You don't have to be blushing from the highlights to the shadows or from the shadows to the highlights. So that means you'll be taking the highlight to the shadow. That means you're going to distract your model's face. So while brushing, you have to be brushing all the highlights for the highlights, the low lights for the low lights, the mid light for the mid lights, or they call it mid tones, high tones, and low tone. In order to see the shadows and highlights well, you have to select black and white layer and blue filter, reduce the layers until the place where you can see very clearly your highlights and lowlights. Then go back to the low frequency layer copy and then continue with the painting process. As you can see, be much more careful. So the beautiness is all between the balancing your blushing process. So while blushing, you don't have to mix the highlights with the shadows or the shadows with the highlights. So you may decide to start with painting the highlights only and then later paint the shadows. And then to make it the transition smooth, you have to paint in between the highlights and the shadows as well, so as to make the transition very beautiful. I mean, the smooth transition should be seen in between the highlights and the shadows. So after painting the highlights and the shadows, that means you have to paint as well in between the highlights and the shadows, so as to make the transition smooth. Just how you can see, guys. You may decide to rename your black and white layer as a check layer because it's checking whether your highlights are painted for the highlights and shadows are painted for the shadows. As you can see, guys, how clear you can see the highlights and shadows while you turn on the black and white layer. You continue painting just how like you can see the highlights and shadows. You don't have to change that because you're going to change the model's face. So you have to consider painting the highlights only in the highlights, and the shadows only in the shadows. You just continue painting until you're satisfied. Slowly, slowly, slowly. Don't be in a hurry because this is your job. Your job is to make sure that your photos are looking stunning. And When it comes to the time that you get used to it, I mean, you'll be quicker than ever. And you'll have to create your own preset and actions. I mean, after painting all the highlights and shadows, don't forget about the transition from the highlight to the shadows. There shouldn't be a sharp transition. That means a transition between highlights and shadows should be smooth. So to get that one, you have to paint in between them, just like that. As you can see, before and after. You just continue painting slowly until you're satisfied with how your models look. Yes, you go down there to the neck, paint just like how you can see I'm following how the shadows and highlights are arranged in the model's body. As you guys can see how the brush has been used, so some of the process I'll be fast forwarding because I don't have to waste that much time, and I'm considering your data as well. You don't have to be watching a long video, longest video. Continue painting. So it's time for the hand. As you can see how I am following the highlights. Time for the highlights, you brush the highlights. And when it comes to for the shadow, you brush the shadows only. And then after brushing all those two, then you have to brush in between the highlights and the shadows so as you can get a smooth transition. Brush all the shadows. So consider this, when you're shifting your brush from shadows to highlight, that means you have to release your mouse. You have to release your mouse so that you don't shift with the darkness into the highlights. As you guys can see, the skin is becoming smooth, just like how we want it, and we retaining the skin texture. You guys can see, zoom out and see the difference between how we started. Or where the skin is thin, you have to brush it. Continue mix brushing. The trick here is highlights and shadows, and in between the highlights and shadows. Remember that in this process we are starting brushing before cleaning the skin. And then after that you can see the before and after, before and after. You can see how the skin is looking smooth, so beautiful, before and after. You continue painting. So I've been drawing this to show you how you're supposed to be brushing. You're supposed to be brushing according to how the shadows or how the highlights falls in the skin, in the model's skin. So in the highlights should be brushed for the highlights only. You can see the highlights skin. The highlights skin, you can see how it's light. You can see how it is light. The mid-tone highlight. Look how the mid-tone looks. See that? The dark tone. So all this should be brushed separately. Should be brushed separately. Before and after.